next item while we're doing that. This is item number 8, Hurricane Ian debrief with preliminary findings, recovery and lessons learned. And this is going to be a discussion topic where we're going to hopefully get some of your feedback. So the purpose of this is a collaborative discussion regarding your initial experiences, data collection and early observations following the storm, with the goal to improve resiliency and responsiveness for future environmental disaster events. CCMP connection. So this relates to water quality improvement priority action 1 to support a comprehensive and coordinated water quality monitoring and assessment strategy, and to assess the report water quality, to assess and report water quality status and trends to identify water quality.
Are we doing this as a round robin, or whoever wants to go first?
Will be a round robin sec, but just by background while we're getting sandwiches and that. So multiple estuaries and watersheds within the CHNEP area were severely impacted by Hurricane Ian. I'm sure many of you know all too well. This discussion will be set up as an opportunity to hear from the various entities regarding their initial experiences, data collection, early observations following the storm. The information gathering effort can be used to collaborate and build tools or resources to make partners more resilient in our responsiveness to storms and other environmental disaster events for the future. So I'll call on each person that submitted information on this to present information on their storm response and to outline any issues and lessons learned. And then we'll go and sort of look in a bit more detail at some of the topics. Okay, next. Okay, so start with the storm response timeline just to set the stage. So week 1 after the storm, partners checked in on safety and offered support to hard hit areas and agencies. Very important. Partners, CHNEP, SBEP, UF, SCCF, and counties, FDP, SwiftMud, coordinated to bring in additional personnel to help with post-Ian water quality sampling efforts in hard-hit areas. The CHNEP created a spreadsheet to coordinate sampling efforts between multiple partners and stakeholders. Situ data and water samples were collected and sent for lab analysis in Lemon Bay and Cape Hayes, and weekly meetings were held with CHNEP and other coordinating partners. In week 2, external partners were lined up to underwrite portions of the sampling costs, and they continued to fund and staff ongoing sampling efforts in Charlotte Harbour proper, as well as the Myakka, Peace and Caloosahatchee rivers. Next slide. Onto week 3, there's continued funding and staff engagement in sampling efforts in the Caloosahatchee, Matlacha Pass and Pine Island Sound, and an online dashboard was created where partner sampling results were compiled. Week 4 and beyond, weekly calls have been moved to monthly and continue to discuss findings with all partners involved. There's continued working with partners to conduct preliminary analysis on the data and coordinating efforts for future disaster response plans. Hurricane Ian resource webpage has been created by CHNEP, which we'll have a look at, and the online dashboard continues to be updated. All right, so first up, Lee, are you in a position to go through some of your initial observations and things at the moment?
There it is.
There it is, yeah, I just want to make sure you went halfway through a sandwich or something.
What else you need?
I guess if you want to maybe read through and if there's any context you want to put behind that.
Traffic was the biggest issue for most all. All the traffic lights mostly were down. It was all four-way stops everywhere you went. And it got really hairy there for a while because not everybody was participating nicely. So getting out and getting samples and getting back were really hard.
That was a combination of the traffic limitations and I guess people's sort of emotions in that situation. Is there anything else, I guess, if you want to read through and any others there that you want to highlight?
Well, unlike other storms that we dealt with, this was the first one that affected the drinking water supply. And that was kind of a interesting situation in that it was due to water pressure drop. It wasn't the plants shut down or any of that. It's just there was so much damage throughout the distribution system that the pressure was dropped below minimum levels. So it was many days before they could close that system up sufficiently where we could even start sampling to get the drinking water supply back to safe levels. That was a really unique situation. I say we never had that happen before. I was told that the main trunk line going to Fort Myers Beach was severed, and they were losing so much water every day that they couldn't even maintain the pressure. And they did not have a cutoff. They had to figure out another way to close that line up. And I don't even know if they have water yet on Fort Myers Beach.
I'll talk a bit about, I guess, 4 and 5, some of the danger and safety issues. Was that just something to be aware of for you, or was there specific incidents that you ran into as part of your work?
Well, the crews going out on the water, we didn't even take our big boat out. We limited it to the small boat because we were told by Marine Services that, number one, all of the channel markers were gone. You didn't even know where the channels were. There was so much debris in the water that you had to be very careful and aware every second you were on the water not to hit something. We heard stories of so many people that lost crops and were in dangerous situations where they were hitting things. We were actually told not to go out on the water for a while, and we didn't until we were kind of given an okay by our Marine Services Department. And then, of course, the safety of handling the water, that came around from all the people that were getting sick. That were catching infections and whatnot from being out there. We pretty much knew that going into it, make sure everybody had proper PPE. But I say that was just something that you really needed to be aware of, and because it's not something that is you think about when you're out there. Everybody saying this is an emergency situation. We got to go out. We got to get water samples, but you have to also look at your personal safety first.
Yeah, to that point, I would just add that we had calls even from city council persons that were aware of, non-functional municipal sewers with, just freely overflowing in the area and stuff, and concerned about public health and safety because a lot of people were out there wading through the flood waters. And so we did put out a social media post, and our Instagram one went somewhat viral, just advising people to take precautions, that to assume that the water was contaminated and that if they had to come into contact, to limit contact, or if they came into contact, to try to rinse with clean water and soap. And a lot of people really appreciated getting that information because, like you said, I don't think the public immediately understood. And the aftermath was Lee County was kind of the epicenter of a lot of, storm related, illness, including like Vibrio infections and things of that nature. So, it was interesting to see the public response. Some people actually were angry that we put that message out. Just a few, we got some, but most people were appreciative of that. And I know talking to you immediately after the storm, it was clear that you all were having to focus and redirect, resources in lab to human health and safety, which made sense. And so then we were trying to figure out how can we help to come in while they're trying to focus on higher priorities. Is there a way to bring in others to come support sampling and things like that? But the same logistical hurdles that you mentioned, trying to find in that area where it was the epicenter of storm impact, to find even boat ramps that were clear enough to put a boat in the water was an incredible challenge that we face. Finding people, manpower, because everyone was redirected to emergency response was a problem. So reaching to the University of Florida and others that were outside the area to come in and bring boats, bring manpower, bring equipment was critical and able to help fill those gaps during the first initial weeks of the storm, especially in the Lee County area, which was pretty much the area that we struggled the most when we were coordinating regional efforts and reaching out to partners because of the incredible scale of impact at Fort Myers Beach and Sandoval in that area. That was the most challenging area.
It is ongoing.
Yes, absolutely. It's going to be a long recovery.
For reference, which boat ramps stayed operational during that time? Is I guess every storm is different, but I guess then.
Yeah, it just depended on, there was a lot of places that were completely shut down and wiped out, but yet there were quite a few. Like our lab had no effects whatsoever, other than power. We had a generator. We were able to continue to work. We did not. We shifted our focus to public concern doing bacteriological for drinking water, and tried to. The surface water just wasn't as important, so we had to put all of our efforts into public safety, which was good because I see Jennifer out there and the University of Florida and everybody else trying to take up the slack on that, so that there was data gathered. It just couldn't come from us because again, we were a government agency that was primarily focused on public health.
Okay.
So thank you for that. And I'm sure if you have any further comments, you'll offer those.
So before we jump to Devin, I guess just while we were sort of getting our lunch and that, maybe just to take a little step back and put a little bit more context in what we're trying to do here. A lot of these points that have been raised are maybe things that we wouldn't necessarily think about. When you write in emergency response plans, they tend to be quite big picture, and a lot of the nitty-gritty details about what happens when the proverbial hits a fan isn't thought of. And that's really what we're trying to get at here is what are some of those on the ground issues you ran into? What worked, what didn't, what just came out left field that you weren't expecting. And So that's really what's still fresh and raw, is to get those down so that you know, when the next one comes, it might be 10 years down the line. There'll be yeah. So
No thanks. No,
Alright.
but not right.
Devin, are you online?
Devin isn't able to be here today, but he went ahead and sent us some, key takeaways from, his area up in Winter Haven.
You're welcome.
And so I'm just gonna, read some of those off, and we do have we have some people on the slide, and I know some people are just attending and sharing theirs, afterwards, so we'll run through the slides really quick. So, what they shared was, up in the Winter Haven area, they saw some lost and damaged sensors, in the Peace Creek due to excessive flow rates. They did not see that in their lakes. Obviously, they didn't have the concern with extreme flows. But one of their biggest issues regarding monitoring had been consistently high water levels, making it hard to find some of the piezometers and staff gauges. So access was one of their main issues. So he said there are some benefits to being at the top of the watershed. Mostly that they didn't experience many issues with the flooding that happened in the riverine systems. Their biggest concern after the storm was that water was able to flow downstream unimpeded. So they discovered some blockages in some of their outflow points, and so that's where some of their efforts were focused. In the future, one of the things they're planning on is expanding their surface level and rainfall sensor network, even in this upcoming fiscal year, so that they have more accurate spatial and temporal picture of their resources. And he also shared a couple of graphics just to show impacts of inland areas. So he said, actually during the storm, Winter Haven received 9.5 inches of rain. But the problem was when it was paired with the extreme amount of rainfall during August and September. So having this additional late storm paired with the 13 inches and 17 inches in August and September respectively resulted in an intense rise in surface water levels all around the area. So you can see there that graph on the right, on the upper right, you can see how high that is. And so that hasn't happened since the storm season in 2004. So pretty record lake levels in their area were some of the results that came up in Winter Haven. And that was it for Devin's update.
Yeah, I think it's a good point about the rainfall that happened before. You know, even the amount of rain that was in some of those very outer bands of the storm was even before the main sort of eye wall and whatnot started coming on shore. Okay, thank you. All right, David Herschel, City of Cape Coral.
David, we see you're on the line, but you are muted. So if you want to unmute at this time. There you go. We are not hearing you though, but it does show that you're unmuted. Are you speaking? Oh, his mic isn't working. Craig, do you want to take over? Craig, you're online as well. Would you like to step in and read these bullets?
Sure. Yeah, the water testing. So like we did, as Rick said, so we like helped Lee County with the drinking water and did very little of the surface waters in the first week or so after. Sampling, the labs to be analyzing samples was a little difficult. Also staffing, so some of the staff were fairly hard hit, so they weren't at work for a couple weeks. Some were off for several days. So we were limited in how many bodies we actually had. We didn't have any, out in the field continuous monitoring equipment. And there was also some issues with, it said channel markers missing, the debris in the water, the we had some like stormwater pond modifications that were flooded out, either with debris pulled into them or freshwater ponds that were inundated with salt water that were damaged. And the equipment was a thing because we had several pieces of equipment in for repair. And so there's, saying it's going to be 3 to 4 months. So we had only just the bare necessity of sampling equipment, sans that we could use. I think that's it.
David also shared some, on the second slide, some ideas for what would be helpful going forward. He recommended standardizing protocols and responsibilities, as opposed to gray areas for standards. So I think this is in particular reference to water quality sampling protocols and having some blanket protocols for things like that, or environmental sampling in general. And then I think this is another key point that he touched on, was that communication with the public and with policymakers following the storm, and how to open up channels of communication to, it looks like the public, and how it's a boat heavy community, and communicating some of the more nuanced items, like not just the direct items like debris, but low dissolved oxygen, turbidity, algae blooms, and seagrass loss are harder to explain to everyday people. And to help them connect the dots. So how to convey educational, informative messaging would be something that would be good to emphasize in the future. And that's all we had for cool.
Okay, this is some comments from Swift Mode. Chris, are you on the line today?
Yeah, I sure am. Can everybody hear me okay?
Loud and clear.
Awesome. Great. Yeah. Hey, everybody. I'm sorry I couldn't be there in person. Unfortunately, I have a pretty nasty chest cold, so it's probably best that I'm not there with you at this moment, but hopefully I'll get to see most of y'all in person at the next meeting. Yeah, so some of the stuff that I wanted to kind of talk about a little bit in terms of lessons learned is we had, way back in 2004, we had kind of participated in an effort to look at water quality in the Peace River and the Charlotte Harbor after the passage of Hurricane Charlie. And then, of course, Francis and Jean after that. And we did some of that work, and it got published in 2006. And about 3 days after Hurricane Ian passed through, we started a conversation. Well, we didn't necessarily start it, but a conversation started amongst a lot of the stakeholders in the region. And Brandon, I think you were probably the one that initiated that. And there was a lot of concern over what might happen in terms of hypoxia, bacteria concentrations, and just overall nutrient loading into the system, given how much excessive rainfall had hit the Peace River Valley. And so we kind of looked at what we had done back in 2004, and we sort of used that as a basis for coming up with a plan of action in 2022 after Ian. And so I want to say, first of all, the level of response and the rapidity at which that response took place was pretty phenomenal. And we learned a lot after Hurricane Charlie. And then, let's not forget Hurricane Irma as well thrown in there, and the red tide event that happened after that. And a lot of the monitoring that was going on for that. We just came off of the Piney Point monitoring that was happening in Tampa Bay. So kind of these responses was a little bit fresh in our minds. And maybe that's why our response was as rapid as it was. Within 3 days of the passage of Hurricane Ian, and in an environment where a lot of the folks down in your area didn't even have homes or were dealing with damage on a personal level, we came together and started coming up with a plan. And so it was a really great group, and that group, as Mark had indicated, continues. We did just drop back from our weekly coordination meetings to monthly meetings. But this also involved partners outside of the region, including folks from the Sarasota Bay Estuary Program. And it's important because of the regional impact of Hurricane Ian. And so we started to include other water bodies outside of the Charlotte Harbor area, such as Sarasota Bay, Little Sarasota Bay, Donna Bay, Roberts Bay, Blackburn Bay. And so we did some work. The district was partnering with the Sarasota Bay Estuary Program to do some of that field work in the lower portion of their estuary program. And then we had our field staff go out and collect data on the Peace River at the locations where we normally collect our ambient water quality sampling. So we had a really long-term data set that we were augmenting with additional sampling and also in situ continuous monitoring for DO, temperature, salinity, and other things. So it was a really a good coordinated effort that continues till this day. And it did include others like Environmental Science Associates who are under contract by Charlotte County, I believe, and Benchmark Environmental Analytic Lab, which was completely overwhelmed and swamped with a lot of their bacterial samples that were being sent in, really stepped up to the plate as well and was turning around data, as well as our own lab in Brooksville. And we were, initially targeting nutrients, DO, salinity, bacteria. And one of the things I think that was really valuable that it was touched on a little bit earlier in this segment was the dashboard and providing kind of that common operating picture to not only us, but also the policymakers and the folks that were asking those questions about bacteria, about just the overall health of these waterways, and is it safe for folks to be in the water? Those are all things that were being added to this dashboard. So I think the dashboard was a really huge value added in this process because it brought that data to life and it allowed people outside of just our group to look at those data as they were coming in. And I always, I got to give a big shout out to Marcus Beck because he's been doing a lot of this coding for Tampa Bay and the water quality dashboard they have at the Tampa Bay Estuary Program. And it was kind of a collaborative effort between him, Miles Medina at the University of Florida, and others that really brought that dashboard to life. And so that was a really, I think, a huge value that we didn't have in the past, partly because we didn't have the technology back in 2004 to do those kind of cool things. I did want to just underscore one thing as a lesson learned here that I think has become really an important aspect to how we at the district deal with emergency management. And that is water quality that's beyond just the immediate human health need is often an afterthought. And perhaps that's appropriate because after a storm, you're trying to get folks back in their homes, you're trying to get power restored, you're trying to get water supply restored, roadways cleared. So there's a lot of priority issues. But that secondary issue of what's the long-term impact? We're seeing red tide right now, persistent off the coast, a little bit reminiscent of what happened after Hurricane Irma. So these are all things that are potentially long-term impacts that have to be thought of that I don't think a lot of emergency managers think about. And so I play a role in the district's emergency operations center as I'm the weather ops lead. So we have a weather team, a weather unit. So I provide all the weather leading up to, during, and then shortly after the passage of a major storm event. And so I kind of learned the process of how emergency operations centers work, how the emergency management community works. I got to attend the governor's hurricane conference last May. I'll be going again next May. And one of the things that I would like to do is really educate emergency managers on the need to have these water quality monitoring support systems in place, because it may be that if a storm hits Charlotte Harbor, you may have crews coming from the St. Johns River Water Management District or Suwannee River Water Management District or the DEP offices in those parts of the state that were not impacted directly by the storm. I guess St. John's is a bad example here because they got hammered pretty hard with Ian. But the point is that I think looking at this from a state perspective and through the eyes and the lens of emergency management is really important. And the case in point with Hurricane Ian was that when Charlotte County was requesting help, I worked with Brandon, and actually Tim Fallon, who is one of our planning leads in our EOC, helped work with Brandon to craft a request for support via the state's web EOC portal. And what that did was that allowed a formal request to go up to the Division of Emergency Management, who then assigned that task in part to the Water Management District. So we were then able to get crews out and do the work. The other advantage to that is that, although I don't think this was the case with Ian, it does potentially allow for reimbursement through FEMA when you go through web EOC. So there's a lot of things like that that I think need to be hashed out during the off season, so to speak, before the next hurricane season starts, that we can maybe get together and formulate a little bit of a plan and educate some of our emergency managers. Most of your EOCs, for those of you who work in county and local governments, you know that your EOCs are completely overwhelmed with dealing with putting infrastructure back online, and that's appropriate. But it could be that folks like the water management districts and our EOCs could help facilitate some of that. One of the things we've recommended to our emergency managers at the district is that we stand up a water quality unit within the chain of command of the Emergency Operations Center. And I think that's going to happen next year, but I'll let you all know. So that was a major lessons learned. I think that I took away from this, and I hope to talk more with the emergency management community to help maybe streamline this process for the next one, because we know there'll be a next one somewhere, hopefully not here for a while. But beyond that, I just want to say we're still working up the data for a lot of the water quality sampling that's been done. We do still have continuous geosensors out in the field. Just really on a very high level, preliminary data that we've been looking at does suggest that most of the water quality locations that we have on the Peace River and Myakka and Big Slough appear to have returned to what we would consider more normal conditions. For example, I was just looking at the Peace River at Fort Meade, and our dissolved oxygen levels there have returned back to what are the historical mean concentrations when you look at the period of record from that station from 1997 to 2022 prior to Hurricane Ian. We're right around that 6 to 7 milligrams per liter concentration. And that's good news. And it also means and suggests that recovery process has taken about 2 months. And that's consistent with what we saw after Charlie. It took about 2 to 3 months for the DO levels to come back to what we thought were more representative of ambient conditions. And it seems like that might be the case for Ian as well. But there's a lot more to come to that. That's about it. I'll shut up and answer any questions if anybody has any. Thanks.
Can I ask Chris a question?
Yes.
Hey, Chris, it's Mindy.
Hey, Mindy.
Hey, I'm glad you were a part of that EOC. I think that's what you're calling it. Because I think don't have that connection to that kind of level. And I guess my question is, if we do have another storm, you talked about a response team. Would that include like a mobile lab? Because I feel like one of the biggest things we struggle with is getting results back right away. And I don't know if that's just a normal, I mean, we're used to it, but is there a way to speed up like the analyses and reporting of the results through a mobile lab potentially?
Yeah, there's a lot of potential there. And I'm glad you brought that up, Mindy, because, it's kind of the lesson learned for me is kind of from both perspectives. It's educating the emergency management community, but it's also helping educate the natural resource management community and kind of melding those two. I'm fortunate in that I have my foot in both of them, so I kind of see the perspective of both. But you're right, that's one of the big issues that we faced this time around too, was getting those data, especially like the bacteria data. And when you've got labs that are just swamped with samples, I mean, it's really hard to get those things out. The only thing I would say from a mobile lab perspective that might be difficult is the whole certification process and making sure that you're producing data that is acceptable. Now, I will say that we did have a lot of conversation about that from the perspective of, do you wait 2 months for the data to become QC'd, or can we use provisional data and couch it as such? And that's actually what we ended up doing, is we just used the data as soon as it came off the bench with the caveat that, these are provisional. And actually DEP was really helpful in that process. Dave Whiting provided a lot of good guidance on, kind of sifting through that, because you don't want to put out there in the public data that may not be QC'd or may not have gone through all of the certification that it needs to. But I think we found a good balance here. But that's certainly a concern, and it's something that maybe we on the water quality monitoring side of the house can talk about, and then I can certainly bring those concerns up at the emergency management level too. Maybe there's ways we can have labs on standby in the event of a storm.
Yeah, thank you. Because I know the public was really concerned about bacteria, and I think we were kind of on the fence, like, well, do we let this data out? I mean, it's probably pretty good. It's like people need to know, how do we disseminate it? So yeah.
Yeah, definitely. And Mindy was a big part of that conversation. So her group was right in the mix. They went out, they actually did a lot of the field work. So, Mindy certainly was one of the key players in this whole process.
Thanks, Mindy. Yeah, that's a good addition to the conversation. Do we have any more?
Yeah, for next slides.
Okay, so what we're going to try and get everyone to go through and get their thoughts down, and then we're going to sort of circle back and delve into some of these issues a bit more. So Ernesto, I believe you're next to.
Okay. Ernesto Lazo de la Vega from the Lee County Hydrant Control District. We have this pond watch program, and I want to thank all my volunteers who feel that there was a lot of salinity changes. In fact, as you know, we had a huge surge of the water, just flooded everything from the cities to the islands. But then the spots, fortunately, you may not see in this slide, but then I put red dots where the highest salinity, and the graph that you see there, those big bars that you see there, they're above 15, even above 20 parts per thousand. That is a serious saltwater intrusion into those ponds, and they happen in a matter of one day, in the day of the storm. So, but then after the month, they sample again and they found these numbers remain there. So it's not washing off. The next slide is showing Lakes Parks. Lakes Parks also got a big flush. This in the middle, somewhere near 41. You got a big flush of salt water. The yellow dots that you see there, they're all about 7 parts per thousand, which is salinity that it will kill plants, kill fish, and they're still there. In fact, we're going there next week to sample that, to see how much the salinity has changed since the last month. This was last month. So we kept monitoring that. There's some freshwater systems above the Lakes Park that are flushing and are helping wash off some of that salinity. Next slide, please. Okay, so these 2 ponds that you see inside the circle, this is one of my homeowners, Pond Watch volunteers. We went there and put the next one slide. We did a profile of oxygen, salinity, and temperature. So the graph, there's 2 ponds, west, 80 west and 80 east. Both receive the water, and the gray, let me point out this, the big line that you see is going from one side of 0 all the way to the right. That is salinity that from the surface, thank you for the arrow. From the surface to the bottom, the salinity has increased, correct, increased tremendously because the salt water is stratified and it's sinking in the bottom. The top of the water column is still fresh water a little bit, but most of the salinity is in the bottom of the pond. Same thing is happening on the bottom, on the pond in the east. The salinity increases as you go down into the bottom. So what to advise to these homeowners who cannot irrigate? They're just gonna have to wait. And that's the end of the story there. We have to wait until the rain comes and start diluting that. The next slide. This is another example for another pond in the very close to the shoreline, so they get incredible amount of salinities. We're talking now 20 parts per thousand. And if you go down the graph, go to the middle, it says 20. And that line that you see there, that's salinity. From 20, you go all the way to 30. Yeah, as you're going down, then the bottom of the pond, that is 30 parts per thousand. That's a brine, salt water, completely staying in there. And that condition on the next slide made destruction of, yeah, that's the graphic that I want. So that's salinity right there where you have the arrow. Thank you. The next slide shows the effect of this salinity. Before, on the left side, you see all the beautiful littoral plants. They plant that gorgeous, so avoids erosion and filtration and habitat for all that was destroyed by the salinities on the right-hand side after Hurricane Ian. You can see all the plants were completely gone. Planted areas, the Sagittarius, they're all gone, completely demolished. The next slide presents the only plant that survived. It was Cream Americanum. That's swamp lily. That was the only ones who survived who can tolerate this kind of salinities. The leather ferns on the left burn completely. That is sad because they have spent so much money and it will take a long time for them to republish and repopulate the littorals on those ponds. The next one, please. And that is my last slide. Sadly, house was damaged, but the car actually floats almost close to getting inside the pond. There were rumors in some ponds that there were cars in the bottom. So we went there with bathymetry to try to find them. We didn't find any, but there is a rumor there's still some. I don't know. I think there were just rumors because otherwise it would be oil in the surface and things like that. But this is a big event that happens in many shoreline communities, and I think we're only advising them to aerate in the case that they have an aeration, just to break that stratification and allowing the rain, the new rain, to come and dissolve that water. It's sad to see a lot of these communities where they were working very hard to have a nice stone water pond and get damaged by that, but it's part of nature and living close to the shoreline. That's all.
I guess the die-off you get from those the saltwater intrusions in there, that's gonna have subsequent effects.
Yeah.
Hey, Ernesto, I have a question. You might know the answer. Is it possible for a homeowners association to file a FEMA claim for damage to stormwater pond mineral zones?
No, I don't know about that. I will have to investigate, but I don't think that's part of that. Maybe.
That rather it is not just purely decorative as a function.
Correct. And they actually.
And it says recognized function. So I'm wondering if something that would be covered by
Well, to be quite honest, I don't know if they priorities of a pond like that.
I know. Look at the way,
I'll find out.
I know as a county, we put everything in our bucket that we can charge, really lost time and effort for samples that were lost with the refrigeration failure.
Thank you, Nestor. Some very different, I guess, perspectives being raised, which is really, really good to see. We're covering the gambit. Nicole, do you want to go through the additional comments that were shared with?
Sure. Yeah, so we just had a few partners that would send one or two comments, so I just compiled them all into one slide. I think we've already discussed this. Lab capacity issues, creating a bottleneck as far as sampling. Another thing that came up was data formatting. So once we did gather that data, having it be in different types of formats took longer for water quality managers, probably Brandon in particular, who helped compile a lot of that data for that water quality dashboard. Took a lot of time and effort to then format it in a way that was consistent so it could be uploaded to the dashboard. So thinking about having some, maybe some common practices for that, I think was the suggestion. areas. We've heard a lot from the coast, but there are some communities that were hit pretty hard inland. There's a photo on the right from DeSoto County. So Hardy, DeSoto, those counties got a lot of flooding. There's limited staffing out there. And a lot of the people that work at local governments are reallocated to public safety issues for obvious reasons, and finding a way to help those partners as well after storms. And the other issues that were brought up were data gaps on how quickly we can know what critical impacts were in order to prioritize responses, and formalizing potentially some sort of communication network or something like that for water quality sampling, some sort of an umbrella for that, or environmental sampling in general. That's all the written comments I received, but I know other people have something.
I guess if I could jump in real quick, I apologize for not putting together a couple slides on this slacker. But I did want to I just throw out a couple things. This is all great feedback. I think the two things to me that really stood out as being a priority is, number one, increasing the nimbleness of response, for lack of a better way of putting it. You know, to Chris's point, we were able to get moving and get mobilized fairly quickly, but from my side, it was a little touch and go initially because, you know, at the end of the day, the only reason why I was able to get our consultants out there and get moving and sample immediately is because the timing of the storm was such that I had a pocket of discretionary funds that just popped into my budget right after the storm hit. And I could use that without having to go to my commissioners or to the budget office or to anybody else. I could bypass that whole process and just go straight out and get samples. If I was in a position where I had to instead go request funds to make this happen, I would have been DOA unless there was some process by which we could have go ahead and gotten some sort of assurance of reimbursement or something through the EOC process. And so it's why I'm really heartened, Chris, with some of the work that you're talking about that you're going to be doing on the EOC side. If there are ways that, you know, we can set things up so that if we're in a position where, if I'm in a less stable position financially at the time storm hits than I was during this one, that I still have the capability to be able to quickly get up and get out there and get samples and get moving, understanding that we're going to be able to have that financial funding piece taken care of. Because that's obviously the key thing with all of this, is being able to get out there as soon as possible and as soon as it's safe to be able to collect the samples. So, you know, the other minor thing that I would mention too, as far as the data stuff goes, I think probably the end point of that, something that Miles and I have been talking about, is really, you know, can we formalize this dashboard into something that is available as a tool when these storms hit, that we can utilize it. I've been doing scripting to transform the data that I get in a format that Miles can more easily process, but there's still processing that has to be done, which takes time. The more time that takes, the longer it takes for the data to go up on the dashboard, and the longer it takes for folks to be able to see the data and take action. So the need to streamline that and make it as quick as possible. You know, I'm, for example, thinking like getting templates set up where people could just drop their data in that template that would then do all the processing for us to spit it out into the dashboard for, you know, Miles to be able to report something like that. That would then increase that or decrease that delay between reporting and posting on the dashboard. I'll also shout out to you real quick, the communication, not just with the public, was important, but also to the commissioners. That was a key thing. I guess it was the week of the 12th. I went up in front of the commissioners to give kind of my discussion about what we're doing, and, you know, all the work that had already been done at that point to assess waters and whatnot. And the next day, my budget was tripled for this. So that played a key role in assuring that I could actually continue to do some of this EN response monitoring in the far future, as we start wanting to evaluate longer term impacts, you know, the harbor and beyond. So that was a big thing. Just real fast, you know, because I don't want to, you know, but in terms of impacts, we saw major crashes in dissolved oxygen, especially throughout the Peace Basin, that actually rebounded within a couple of weeks, amazingly enough. And at that time, like, we were seeing close to zero in our neck of the woods in the Peace River. The conductivity was around 70 to 75 microsiemens, basically talking straight up rainwater. It was pretty incredible for someone like myself who wasn't here for Charlie and these other, major storms to see this sort of thing. We had a number of bacteria issues over in the west side of the county, most of which have stabilized. There's one that's still problematic, and we actually pulled source tracking samples a few weeks ago just into DEP to try to get an idea if that's something going on that we need to look at from a utility standpoint, infrastructure standpoint, or if it's just, ongoing natural issues or whatever. So as I get more info on that, I'll pass it along. But yeah. So.
I just wanted to add to what you just said, because I think that was something that we definitely experienced firsthand, is like we got some assistance. UF was nimble and able to come in immediately and help with a lot of things, but then we ran into lab processing costs and things like that. We were able to loop in, some kind of non-traditional partners. We had the Conservancy of Southwest Florida pitch in to cover lab costs for a while, so that we could keep things, getting analyzed in a timely fashion. So, shout out to these other partners beyond our normal circle here, but I think it was when you have a whole region impacted immediately, you have to think of people beyond your normal sphere to come in and assist. And I would say that I don't know if you all recall, but maybe about a year ago, we had a red tide themed presentation from Pinellas County about how they keep an emergency response scope on hand for when there's fish kills, that they are able to readily deploy resources, including like an emergency response contractor that subs to fishermen to go out and collect the fish out of the water. Well, I'm just thinking that's a similar model that we in governmental spheres need to have, where you could do task order based, scopes that then just sit there at the ready. We would obviously need to budget and keep some kind of emergency fund on hand, but we would have the procurement already in place, where then if an event like this happens, you issue that task order and you get immediate assistance. So there, all these types of ideas are percolating, and that's what we were hoping today to continue to hear, like your updates, but then maybe if we had time to do a brief exercise to kind of gather thoughts on what's our takeaways, and is there something that the TAC wants to do? And we, after we hear all these ideas, is there something that we ourselves as a partnership committee can try to pursue, building such a scope or building such a emergency response water quality plan where we understand who's going to do what. And, we have Charlotte County building a warehouse for emergency supplies. We could purchase supplies. I spoke with the administration, they'd be willing to maybe house those supplies, in the event of an emergency, because we ran into problems where we didn't have sampling bottles. We didn't have filters. We didn't have, basic supplies to do the sampling. So we're just trying to gather lessons learned so that maybe we collectively can help this region advance its preparedness for the next storm. I know that Mindy were there other updates in the room?
Chris says.
Oh, Chris, I'm sorry. I see your hand is up online.
Hey, yeah, no, that's okay. I think it's a great idea. And I don't know how far we're going to get today, because we're kind of all talking to each other, but a lessons learned type, maybe even perhaps a kind of in a workshop environment where we bring in those representatives from each local government's emergency management community to share those ideas, because I think what you're saying, it makes a lot of sense, and it would be fantastic to have those types of resources at the ready. I just don't know what the mechanism is to make that happen, but I'm thinking that anything along those lines is going to have to happen through those emergency management plans that are in place. So almost like have a water quality chapter written within those plans. But like, how do we start that conversation? And I think the best way to do that is to kind of figure out a way to merge those two communities, our water quality monitoring community with the emergency management community of these respective local governments and regional and state agencies as well, and kind of maybe come to a consensus. Because I think in theory, it's a great idea and it's been talked about before, and we've talked about it at the district, and it's just, there's some financial hurdles, I think, and some logistical hurdles. And to me, at least after having gone through this experience, a lot of the hurdle is just education, not really making the emergency management community really understand the importance of this, and then it may go on for 2 or 3 months or longer, depending on, if we see red tide or other things happening, dead fish and other issues. So I think it's a great idea. Maybe we should do that as a, maybe have an effort to have a specific workshop where we get all those players in the same room and we hash it out.
No, that sounds good, Chris. And we actually had a similar idea around that. That's on one of the slides. We were thinking of doing a Minty. I don't know if we're gonna have time to do it now, but we did have some ideas that we wanted to float out and gauge the level of interest in. And that was one of them. So thank you. And I also saw something in the chat from Kevin, who mentioned that, yes, he's supportive of a scientific monitoring emergency response plan being developed. Any other comments? We still have about 10 to 15 minutes.
Yeah. One thing, Chris, you might be talk to this bit as well, and Bren, you touched on it as well. The response we had was incredible and was very rapid. To what extent was that a combination of good fortune and also working relationships that are already well established? If all the agencies went through staff turnover at just the wrong time, and those people across agencies didn't have each other's cell phone number, would that have replicated? And I think that's something, while we pat ourselves on the back for responding as well as we did, it doesn't mean that things can't be improved and things can't be formalized. So I just big context to some of those.
Well, and that's a good point, because honestly, with the EOC side of this, when filing the emergency request, it would have been much more difficult for me to have navigated that process had Chris not been willing to assist me with that, and had I not already known who he was, and there wasn't already that kind of informal communication going on about this, prior to putting together the thing. And so I neglected to do this before, but yeah, Chris, thank you so much for really helping to kind of shepherd that process through, because to your point earlier, there is no way I would have gotten a similar request through our emergency management system in any kind of timely manner, because like you said, they were 100% focused on major public health and safety issues that were going on at the time. So yeah, I mean, but the other side of it too, Mark, is that the solution still has to be something that is very easy and streamlined. Like if you create just another framework by which people could, submit a request or notify or whatever to remove the need to know who to talk to, then are you going to risk creating some level of bureaucracy and delay that would then, impede the process out of it?
Yeah. Good point. The conversation just organically has been really good. We do have, I guess, some guidance questions to follow up and a little bit of structural response to maybe flesh some of that out, or to take some key issues forward that we can maybe discuss at a later workshop. So yeah, the underlying question here is where to from here. So is there what is one action item or some action items that you've heard today from everyone's perspective that we could dig into and build a framework, create a response network. What could be included in that plan, and what are some of those critical supplies you need, critical workflows that we need to have in place, for and relationships we need in place before we sort of go.
All right, yeah, just so, before we get in the weeds about water quality too, I think, so we have like a hurricane plan for our office, but we also have like Ariel developed a post-hurricane monitoring plan, like what do we want to focus on after hurricanes? And obviously, yeah, one is water quality, but we also want to look at some of the islands that serve as recreate habitats for birds. You know, they have been severely eroded. So these are more longer term projects, but you know, what is the seagrass doing? We've looked at some of our seagrass sites and they don't look so good. You know, there's been erosion and accretion, lots of sediment shifting. So there's other besides water quality. Oh, there it is. There you go. Yeah. Can we do living short? Yeah, exactly. Like, can we do a habitat restoration? Yeah. So, okay. Yeah, you covered that all. Cool.
One of an interesting thing that could be included in whatever plan that happens is something that you and I have been discussing, Mindy, is there was, you know, we have Eyes on Seagrass in the county, which is this great volunteer effort that, you know, kind of gets a snapshot on a pretty wide scale. But then you have that moment where you're like, okay, there's a bunch of Vibrio and we don't know what's in the water. Where is the line at which we say it's safe to deploy volunteers? I've surveyed them. They're interested because, you know, much like people, they're willing to help, but we've been discussing whether or not it's better to wait. Our normal schedule would be until the spring, but I would be interested. I don't know if DOH or, you know, there was some official statement on this is when we feel like it's safe to put people back.
Discussion last week in the Southwest water quality, like Friday meetings that we have, and
Yeah.
the same discussion the past week is when is it safe for volunteers to go back in the water? They determined it was safe, according like Sarasota County determined it was safe for their volunteers to get back in the water as of like last week.
Okay.
But they were basing it off inter counts, I believe.
Mhm.
And so that was how they were using. I don't know what their exact limit was.
Yeah, because one of the other things, and I'll just make a plug, is that next week, I and a couple other extension agents from various impacted regions are doing a webinar on best practices for hosting volunteer mangrove debris cleanup days. So it'll discuss not only just the biology of not letting the volunteers impale themselves on mangroves, but also some of the biology and stuff and how to manage volunteers next week on December 6th, if anybody's interested. That's been a line of discussion as I'm like, what are statements are we about to put out into the world about when it's appropriate to put, you know, Joe Schmo in the water?
Right. I think Department of Health is a group that I really want to pull in on future conversations about this for multiple things. But and especially too, because in defining, you know, if we're going to do work and use some of this effort to try to discuss when it's safe and not safe, that we have to draw lines as to what we define as safe, right? You know, if and what metrics we're using for that, and what language goes along with that to say, you know, it is as safe as the water typically is, but we're not saying that you can go and, you know, drink it and be fine. Well, you know, that kind of thing. So it's just kind of the world we live in. So, but I will personally, I'm continuing to poke at DOH, see if, you know, we can get them to the table to have kind of a debrief discussion. Because I'll tell you from my perspective, as I was going out there and collecting these samples and I'd see what I see, I would turn around and say, DOH, here's what we're finding. You know, to keep them informed in the event that they want to take action based on that. You know, and so I get a little frustrated occasionally because I'm not Department of Health, so I do not have jurisdiction to say something is safe or not safe. But I can collect the information and pass on to the folks who do have the authority. And so how that communication should occur, and what the expectations are for communication from each party is something that I definitely want to, you know, dive into further.
Yeah, they definitely need the data to issue some sort of advisory. So if nobody's collecting red tide or bacteria, then
Right.
I mean, during this emergency, they're focusing on drinking water, so they don't have staff to go out and collect samples themselves. So
Right.
husband works for the county DOH, so I'm telling him like, there's a lot of red tide. Issue something.
I think we were the only county out of Charlotte, Lee, and Collier that didn't, like, Lee and Collier both had advisories out. Their DOHs did, but Charlotte did not. On a very different note, I'd also be interested to know where we think marine industries fall and whether or not they should be included in the plan. I spent a lot of time talking to like the shrimp fishermen that are down in, at Fort Myers Beach that, they've got their steel hull 20-ton boats still up in the mangroves and are camped out on the dock. They're looking for work. Jen mentioned, including them in debris cleanup. I didn't know if that was within the scope of what this plan would be as well.
So just before, maybe, Cole, if you want to maybe just cycle through the slides back and forth, just so people
Okay,
can see.
I'll go back to the beginning here.
Yeah, we don't need to necessarily go to the Mentimeter, but there's a lot to dig into, and obviously there's interest in doing it. But just while we're talking, just be aware that there's some guiding questions up there that to get your mind thinking offline as well, and to come back to as well.
Yeah, so I think that we hear that there's a lot of interest and that taking a deeper dive on this issue. So, we'll regroup as a team. Maybe we can do something virtually. Maybe we do an in-person workshop. I heard through the chat, an idea of combining with Sarasota Bay, Tampa Bay. Maybe we do some kind of virtual workshop where we can bring in a broader audience that, doesn't have to drive hours to get here. But we definitely have an exercise where we want to gather input, because I do think we as a committee could potentially create a plan and then have appendices like these scopes of work that local government could use, resources to help, make sure that going forward, we know a little bit more about who's doing what, where labs are. I mean, we had all sorts of things. We were scrambling on the fly this time to piece that information together. We have some of it now, but over time we need to come up with like, what are the plan Bs? What if those labs are diverted? What other options are there? All of that can be sorted out in a workshop. So we'll figure out how to see if we can fill that gap, or, work with some partners to organize something like that. If you all, it sounds like, are interested in participating. All right. Okay, well, then we won't have time to go through it today, unfortunately, but we will bring back these questions at that workshop.
And a great discussion nonetheless, though. I think a lot of ground was made just getting that out, those ideas out there.
Mm-hmm.
All right. So
One more thing.
Yes. That's
Sorry,
right.
we have one thing to update you guys. It's in development. The staff at the CHNEP has been hard at work, and special recognition to Nicole and Serena, who've been very involved in this. But we have developed a Hurricane Ian page where we are trying to house key information that we've been able to gather through this event and after the event. You'll see some snippets here, but if you just go on our CHNP.org website and click on Hurricane Ian in the header, it'll take you straight to this page. You can check out, not only does it cover, the storm, but also it has by basin kind of takeaways. So you can click on Lemon Bay or Pine Island Sound and kind of see some of the key takeaways that we've been able to gather through the data collected and reported so far. There's great interactive maps. Some of them are embedded from partner websites and things like that. Nicole, Serena, do you have anything to add on that you want to highlight about the page?
We're continuing. We found so much information out there that we wanted to pull into one resource for our region in particular. We found a lot of things for other areas, but we're continuing to build upon it. Serena's compiled a huge amount of information, and we'll continue to build it. If there's something that you see that you think would be helpful, please reach out to us and let us know, or something that you don't see on that page already, for data and information or communications or anything like that.
Yeah, it's meant to be a collective hub. So if, the water quality dashboard we talked about, other things that are being developed, if those can be shared, we're going to integrate them into this page so that it hopefully becomes kind of a one-stop shop for finding a lot of that information in one place. So just let us know if you have any ideas after taking a look at it. We really appreciate your feedback.
All right, so no current actions for this, but we'll, I guess, look out for So there's no formal action here, but look out for further discussions and maybe a workshop on this topic.